Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday edition. The Michael Cohen testimony wasn't the only big news involving President Trump this past week. While that was going on, the president was in Vietnam for a summit with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. President Trump, who has boasted of his ability to strike deals, expressed high expectations for an agreement to eliminate North Korea's nuclear program. But as Nicole Killian reports, the talks collapsed.
President Trump says North Korea wanted too much to end its nuclear program, so he walked away.
Basically, they wanted the sanctions lifted in their entirety, and we couldn't do that.
North Korea says it only wanted partial sanctions removed, and in exchange, it would dismantle its Yongbyon nuclear research facility.
This proposal was the biggest denuclearization measure we could take at the present stage in relation to the current level of confidence between the DPRK and the United States.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi praised the president's decision to end the talks.
Really, it's good that the president did not give him anything for the little that he was proposing.
The leaders of South Korea and Japan say they spoke by phone with President Trump after the summit. Both say the president remains committed to following through on more talks in the future. General Vincent Brooks, a former commander of U.S. forces in Korea, tells CBS News that the process takes time.
North Korea is a country that doesn't understand trust. It doesn't have trust internally, and it doesn't have trust experience externally. And so we shouldn't be surprised that they tripped here.
And he pointed out that it has been 450 days since the North Koreans last tested a nuclear missile. Nicole Killian, CBS News, the White House.
So what to make of the summit and where the denuclearization efforts go from here? Back with us is attorney Heather Heidelbaugh of the firm Leach Tishman and a former Republican member of Allegheny County Council. And joining us now is Dr. Andrew Simpson, assistant professor of history at Duquesne University. So was the talks, or was the summit, in your estimation, a failure for the U.S., for North Korea, or for both?
I think it's a moment of resetting. If anyone had expected that a big deal was going to come out of this, and I think the president had hoped that a big deal was going to come out of this.
Signing ceremony.
Right? In that sense, it's perhaps a failure. I think if we look at actually what we gave up or what we didn't give up in this case, we may want to just call it a draw and leave it at that. It was certainly a moment where both sides didn't realize their goals going into it. We'll see how this plays out here over the next year or two.
Heather, are you surprised that the president walked away when there was speculation he would want to come away with something to distract from the Cohen testimony?
I was extremely happy, very relieved and happy that he walked away, that he was not pressured into a wag the dog type of situation where he felt like he had to bring home a winner in order to get the focus off of the Cohen testimony.
Are these bilateral talks the best strategy, in your opinion, leader to leader, as opposed to what former administrations have done, working at a lower level to try to build from the ground up, as opposed to coming at it from the top down?
Are we talking about this in terms of actual diplomacy, or are we talking about this in terms of politics for 2020?
Diplomacy. Actually getting something done with regard to denuclearizing North Korea.
I think from a diplomatic level, you really have to have this build-up at a lower level. Certainly bringing two leaders together in a room and building that mutual relationship is important. We've seen numerous evidence of this over the course of the 20th century, whether it's bringing, Nixon going to China and having a sort of very splashy moment, whether it's talks between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We've seen how personal chemistry really does make a difference. But those deals were also had a substantial amount of work done at the lower levels. Diplomats on the front lines thinking about what this agreement was going to look like. And I think that was largely the concern about this, was that the president was going to North Korea. Nobody knew what the strategy necessarily was. And the concern was that he would give up a great deal for very little, as Speaker Pelosi had sort of mentioned. Now, that didn't come to pass, but the White House has said, look, we're going to continue these talks at a lower level. So hopefully something comes out of it. And frankly, we need to address the issue of North Korea's nuclear program. So I think it's an important thing.
Can you talk a little bit about both the president's statement on Otto Warmbier and his parents' rebuttal on that statement post-summit? President Trump made a very positive statement saying he believed Chairman Kim. How does that play in the U.S., particularly following the statement today?
I think it's a troubling statement, and I think we have seen a pattern of an unwillingness to confront what our moral obligations are as a country. And that raises some serious questions about if we really value what we say we do, if we value this idea of human rights. Well, we can't simply say we accept someone who has a notorious human rights abuse record at their word, whether that's Vladimir Putin, whether that's Kim Jong-un. And that raises questions about what are we willing to give up to get these sort of deals, which then I think we might think have a sort of political ramification going into an election. And, you know, this is a pivotal moment for us in terms of thinking about how we place short-term gain versus long-term values.
It was mystifying to me in light of the many statements made by this president in regard to the various dictators in the world, including Putin, the recent killing of Jamal Khashoggi, a member of the press, and a willingness to put this in some sort of master negotiating instead of in terms of we are the light of the world in terms of our democratic and human rights ideals, and there will never be we will never defer from that. That is our number one goal, to increase human rights in the world, and certainly respect that. And so for the president to come out and say that he believed a brutal dictator had no knowledge, had no involvement in the killing of Otto Warmbier when he was just a student and took down a poster, it was a moment of, it should be a moment of deep reflection for all of us as we look at the 2020 election and what we're going to do. It was shocking.
Yeah, we shouldn't lose sight. We're talking about the brutal torture of an American college student.
Correct.
And to simply just dismiss it, well, I believe that that Kim Jong-un said he didn't have anything to do with it, so everything's okay, let's talk about moving forward. That really, I think, is something.
What would make you believe this dictator?
It's a college student who was arrested in North Korea for stealing a poster while on a trip. He was studying abroad in Hong Kong and went on this trip to North Korea, and he stole a poster, and for that he was jailed and ended up losing his life over it. But what's the very tangible moral hazard of a president of the United States not only meeting with and negotiating with a dictator, but the fawning, talking about the beautiful letters, the lavish praise? What message, what tangible message does that send to Vladimir Putin, to MBS, to other autocrats about what you can get away with? And the United States will look the other way.
Right, and I think that the answer to that question begins with just even all of us in terms of foreign travel. Have any of us now thought that we're at risk as Americans in terms of traveling? You know, are the dictators of the world, are the bad elements of the world emboldened? And what will our country's response be to it? That when the dictator comes out and says, well, they're a spy, you know, it didn't happen, are we all now more at risk because of an unwillingness for the full weight and force of the U.S. and the U.S. military to defend its citizens abroad?
Well, I think your question, if I can just jump in real quick, I think your question is interesting in two parts. The long history of American foreign policy is we have to sit down with leaders with whom we disagree with their leadership style. We have to sit down with dictators. We have time and time again realized that putting American foreign policy interests and the safety of Americans abroad requires us to do that. The dangerous part is fawning over that. And the dangerous part is walking into a room and assuming that we can't bring forward values of human rights, values of democracy, values of how we see things moving forward, and point out that there are some real serious issues with the way that these countries are being governed, because, again, that does open the door to emboldening these dictators to continue to abuse human rights. And we think about sort of going back to even World War I or the Atlantic Charter. We've put forward this idea that human rights are essential to how nations should see themselves and conduct themselves, and that there's certain requirements for being part of a global system. And letting people who abuse and flagrantly abuse that and giving them a free pass diminishes our standing as a nation as well in the world.
We're just down to about 30 seconds. Don't we have to give this administration, this president, credit for the fact that North Korea has not launched any missile tests in over 400 days?
I think it's important to acknowledge that what the president is doing in negotiating with North Korea is important. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there certainly have been some successes that have come out of this. That said, we do need to be cautious about the style of diplomacy we're engaging in.
Heather, final comment?
The nuclearization program, as I understand it, in North Korea has continued. The testing has been on a stop, but the program is not stopped in any way. So I don't know if we are safer.
We will leave it there. Thank you both very much. Back with some final thoughts on the KDPG Sunday edition in just a moment.